everybody, or good evening if you're logging in from Japan. I'm letting everyone log on to this webinar space. So if you can give us 2 minutes or so, we will get started right after. Okay. I think some people may be still trickling in, but we have a limited time, so we will. Once again, good morning for those of you who are logging in from the United States, and good evening for those of you out there who are logging on from Japan and the rest of Asia. My name is Yuki Takeda, Director of East Asia Program and Director of Japan Program at Stimson Center. Welcome to the webinar, Evolving Maritime Issues in Indo-Pacific. We're delighted to host this webinar. And this is our first experiment of doing a 2-panel webinar, so we'll see how it goes. Just the administrative announcements. This translated. So for those of you who would prefer to listen to the whole seminar in Japanese, please click the global icon right farthest right on the globe, and you will be able to choose your language. And when it comes to the Q&A time, please do use the Q&A box, the question, and our staff will monitor that box. And I just wanted to make sure. I just wanted to make sure that. But it looks like I may be having some audio issues. So if you can, okay.
How is this?
Is this better? All right. So let's proceed with the more ground rules. So please do use Q&A function at the again bottom of the screen to ask type in your questions, and our staff will monitor and cue the moderators in. So with that, let's get started with the panel. And let me introduce you the moderator of the first panel, Professor Raul Pete Pedroso, who's a captain. Pete Pedroso, who's a professor at the Stockton College. And I will yield the floor to you, Pete. Take it away.
Thank you, Yuki, and thank you for the invitation and the ability to participate in this webinar. Our two speakers today are going to be talking about the evolution of the legal framework for maritime security and its impact on Western Pacific. And our two speakers are experts in the field. Many of you know them, Professor Yurika Ishii from the National Defense Academy of Japan, and Dr. James Kraska, who is the chair and Charles H. Stockton Professor of International Maritime Law at the Stockton Center for International Law at the U.S. Naval War College. Dr. Kraska is going to focus on the erosion of norms in Northeast Asia, and then he will be followed by Professor Ishii, who will be talking about updates, the recent updates of Coast Guard laws in Southeast and Northeast Asia that have an impact on maritime security. So James, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Professor Pedroso, and thank you very much for the Stimson Center's efforts to better understand the U.S.-Japan relationship and the security dynamic in East Asia. It's a joy to be part of these events, and I want to emphasize that these are my personal views. They do not necessarily reflect the policy or position of the Department of Defense, the U.S. Navy, or the Naval War College. What I thought might be helpful as an introduction is to talk about how norms have eroded over the past 70 years or so since the end of World War II. And these views are informed by the School of Legal Realism that was developed by Roscoe Pound at Harvard Law School. And it very much is in a struggle to shape the law with a counter view of legal formalism that we see very popular, particularly among international law scholars, and especially those in Europe, that really look toward what is the law on the books as the guide to what's going on in reality. The problem with that perspective, as Roscoe Pound pointed out, is that there's one thing to have law on the books, but there's another thing to look at law in action. And I think that we can all agree that law has not provided the stability and security and predictability that it might optimally do so. So I'll just cover some of the high points of the erosion of these norms, and then maybe offer a thought or two on what utility international law might serve to achieve these higher goals. So after World War II, there was general respect for international law in East Asia, but of course that was underwritten by American security and a Navy that had more than 1,000 ships. And even at this time, though, there were incidents, including shooting incidents against U.S. aircraft, but these were primarily by the radical regimes in North Korea and also in mainland China. And so these were isolated incidents, and of course, China was much less powerful, needless to say. And yet they did occur near shore, attacks on U.S. vessels and attacks on Western aircraft that were offshore. Of course, people are familiar with the attack on the Pueblo in 1968, just one example, that attack that occurred in international waters. I would say that the incidents with the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 are not quite the same model, because these could be seen more as part of the Vietnam War rather than breaks of the peace during peacetime. China was a participant, an active participant, and indeed leader in the negotiations for the third UN Conference on the Law of the Sea for the UNCLOS Convention, but it promoted creation of the exclusive economic zone and sought to extract benefits from seabed mining as one of the G77 states. And so the cost of pocketing those benefits for China was to acquiesce to the navigational regimes that we have now. So China, of course, at the time was coastal oriented from the 1960s into the 1990s. And that was really when things began to change. In the late 1990s, there were a number of incidents in which China began to interfere with military activities off its shore beyond the territorial sea. And this is ironic because by a full decade before that, by 1989 or 1990, the United States and the West and Japan really did not need China as a balance against the Soviet Union. And yet still it was 7 or 8 years later that China began to actively, as part of a concerted campaign, interfere with military activities offshore in asserting jurisdiction offshore. Yet the United States and Japan continued to engage and obviously deepen ties after China joined the World Trade Organization. But there were other incidents as well. We're familiar with China's cyber attacks, for example, but even in the 1990s, there was an incident where Chinese officials tried to ship some 2,000 AK-47s into the port of Los Angeles to fuel the gang wars in Los Angeles at the time, efforts to destabilize our countries. So not just North Korea, but China doing these activities. And you can find this on Google. It was a US Customs incident. And this 2,000 AK-47 shipment was just a test shipment. They wanted to flood American streets with AK-47s, 25 years ago. The next phase, I think, which was really the inflection point that puts us in the contemporary era, was the EP3 incident in 2001, in early 2001. And people, I think, are familiar with this incident where the US aircraft was detained and the aircrew were detained for more than a week. Contrast that with the 2016 Iran Farsi Island incident, where two riverine coastal boats were detained by Iran on suspicion of violating innocent passage. And once that was cleared up, that detention, as bad as it was for the United States, still lasted less than a day. And yet China didn't choose to diffuse the EP3 incident, but rather sought to magnify and fan the flames and make it an issue. And incidentally, of course, that EP3 aircraft, that Professor Pedroso was on the US negotiating team with the Chinese at the time, I would add, was some 75 miles in international airspace. So China's new claims over the EEZ were as disorienting in the current era, beginning in the late 90s and since then, as the 9-dash line is today. Because remember, China had always bought into the law of the sea as a package deal. And there's no record of any sort of objection to this package deal during the negotiations, the voluminous 17 volumes recorded by the United Nations. China never mentioned any of these current issues. So China's maritime laws are to be understood as not a guide to Chinese actions. If you want to know what's going to go on in Japan or in Germany and what is lawful and not lawful, or in the United States, you can look at the laws as a point of departure for predicting what the state will do. I would suggest that that's not the case with Japan, that the laws, with China rather, the laws are a lagging indicator, and that China does what it wants geopolitically, and then it creates the laws later on to rationalize or to justify those behaviors. China makes extra legal arguments to support or advance its claims. It uses old terms in new ways, such as using Article 58 due regard standard to mean that states must exercise due regard, meaning that states must recognize China's interests, using old terms in new ways. And then China also uses new terms that are invented out of whole cloth. We're familiar with the arguments over adjacent waters and relevant waters in the South China Sea is just two examples of that. The effect of this has been a knock-on or follow-on effect where other countries in the region have begun to unilaterally adopt rules that are also inconsistent with the law of the sea convention. One example recently is Thailand in the last decade or so, which adapted its rules on the EEZ to conform to China's views. Another example would be out of the norm would be Indonesia's practice that they've since walked away from of sinking fishing vessels, trying unilateral new approaches that are beyond the accepted norms. China has also tried to walk back Japanese sovereignty, for example, over the Senkaku Islands. And this has been, in my view, a function of the political landscape. That over the past 20 years, the United States was focused on Iraq and Afghanistan. The Secretary of Defense at the time, in the early 2000s, it was said in the Pentagon that if it's not Iraq and Afghanistan, the Secretary of Defense doesn't want to know about it. And so there's this singular focus on Southwest Asia, and other things fell on the floor. Of course, a superpower has to be able to walk and chew gum, and that was not done through both Democratic and Republican administrations. Furthermore, even though you have 7th Fleet and 3MEF Marine Corps in Okinawa and US Forces Japan, in my view, there's not been a real alliance integration. We're approaching that situation, but it has not happened in the past. It's just been that that there's been a stationing of forces, but not a real integration of strategic visions by the United States and Japan. This is because the United States wanted to have free agency, unrestrained or unconstricted by the alliance. And of course, Japan had its constitutional issues. This is also starting to change very slowly. I'll end with two things that I think the US did that lost an opportunity to bolster the rule of law in the region. The first is walking back the US understanding that the Senkaku Islands were part of Japan. This is the understanding that US occupational forces had after World War II and up until 1970. And then, of course, with Nixon's trip to China, that began to erode and become ambiguous, and the United States did not want to take a position. The problem with this is that the US, on the one hand, did not support an ally, and on the other hand, was not seen as neutral as it thought it would be with China. China never thought that the United States would be neutral, and indeed it cannot be because the US has an alliance with Japan. There's a similar dynamic with US lack of recognition of Philippine control over Scarborough Shoal that has similarly contributed to a weakening of rule of law and the US alliance on the southern tier. So with that, providing just a backdrop on the erosion of these norms, I would say that things are starting to turn. There are some bilateral negotiations between countries in the region, in particular in Southeast Asia, to try to gain better understanding, such as the US or the Indonesia-Philippine agreement over the EEZ in the Celebi Sea, Vietnam-Malaysia MOU for maritime security, and the Vietnam-Indonesia MOU for maritime security. So I think things are starting to change, but what we really need is a greater multilateral approach, and Japan and the United States are the anchors for this type of endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Eureka, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pedroso. And I'd like to start off by thanking Stimson Center for having me in this very important panel. So let me start by sharing my slide. In the next 10 minutes, I will talk about the recent updates of Coast Guard laws in Southeast and Southeast Asia and Northeast Asian region. My concern is that those laws might include potentially excessive maritime claims and also potentially excessive standards for the use of weapons. And I believe that my talk will relate to what Professor Praska just said. So we have seen that countries in the region have recently updated their Coast Guard laws. Last year, in the Stimson Center's panel, I criticized the enactment of Chinese Coast Guard Act that it contains many provisions that might conflict with the law of the sea. But we have seen other countries that are reorganizing their Coast Guard laws, and they also include the concepts that concepts that do not exist under UNCLOS, or that might be potentially excessive in light of the established international law. So, particularly we have seen the updates and reorganization of the Coast Guard agencies in China, Indonesia, and Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and some of them explicitly authorize the law enforcing agencies to act to protect its maritime security and sovereignty. Now, it does not mean that it is problematic, but usually the Coast Guards are considered to be domestic agencies, and therefore it is a concerning trend that these domestic laws mandates the protection of the security and sovereignty. Now, of course, we have to look at the structure of each country's maritime security law, because the maritime security law is not only the organizational or administrative law, but every country has to take a balance between their security interests and their domestic legal structures. So they have to look at the mandates of the Coast Guard and the Navy, and also they have to establish their maritime entitlement. And then they also have to, set up the standard for the use of weapons. And those concerns and interests may differ from a state to another. Now, in a recent book that I published from Brill, Japanese Maritime Security and Law of the Sea, I have explored the history of Japanese maritime security law. And I think that the same has to be done in each country for the further research. Now let me briefly explain what I think to be potentially excessive maritime claims. As many of you may be familiar with, the law of the sea divides maritime area into columns, and they allocate the jurisdiction on each column. Now, the most important line I'd say is the line between the territorial sea and the water area beyond the territorial sea, because that distinguishes the maritime zone that are subject to the sovereignty of the coastal state and the waters that are open to every state. Now, if you look at the coastal guard laws, some states uses the concepts that do not exist in UNCLOS. Now, it does not mean that using such a concept itself is problematic. But my concern is that by using these concepts, some laws looks like that they authorize their Coast Guard agencies the power that is not justified under UNCLOS. So I will not go into detail regarding the Chinese Coast Guard law, but one of the concerns is that the law authorizes Chinese Coast Guard to, for instance, coercively evict or tow foreign warships and government ships used for non-commercial purposes from jurisdictional maritime area, which includes EEZ and other jurisdictional waters subject to China's jurisdiction, which might include the internal water of 9-9. But other states also include similar provision. For instance, a Malaysian Maritime Enforcement Agency Act authorizes the agency to expel foreign vessel, which it has reason to believe to be detrimental to the interest of or to endanger the order and safety in Malaysian maritime zone. And as you can see, that includes the water beyond the territorial sea. It includes EEZ and continental shelf. Similarly, Thailand includes the provision that authorizes the agency to take action against foreign vessel within the maritime zone that includes EEZ. So that's one thing. The other thing is that some of the Coast Guard laws authorizes the agencies to use weapons in excess of what is established under international law. Now, in Saiga case of 1999, International Tribunal for Law of the Sea held that when enforcing its law, there are certain standards under general international law. So first, the use of force must be avoided, and if unavoidable, it must not go beyond what is reasonable and necessary. And also consideration of humanity must apply. Now, some laws do not comply with these standards. For instance, Chinese Coast Guard law provides that the CCG can use weapon under Article 50, and it does not, for instance, provide the obligation to give the prior warnings, or there seems to be no complementary requirement and humanity principle. And also, if you look at Vietnamese law, there seems to be no explicit provision on the reasonableness, complementary, and humanity requirements. So that does not mean that they are, in conflict with established international law. But my concern is that if states, exercise its power as it is authorized under their domestic law, there might be a standoff or conflicts between Coast Guard agencies. So I will stop here and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Eureka and James, for those excellent presentations and overview. We will open it up to questions. Certainly someone has a question. Here's a question for you, James. Japan and Australia have often supported the USA in combating the legal overreach of nations like China. But where is the other key US ally in Asia, South Korea, in all of this? Is it just me, or does it seem to be needlessly uncooperative in fighting China's transgressions in the East and South China Seas?
Thank you for the question. So what I would suggest that it's a community effort, and that states that share our values, Korea is one of them, India, Australia, and there are Philippines, and there are others. And the Koreans certainly have a unique position. They're the bulwark against North Korean aggression in the region, as well as have a land proximity, as well as maritime space that abuts with China. So I think that Korea contributes, and each country contributes in their own way with the capabilities that they have, and given their situation. What I would suggest is that all countries that share these values ought to be doing more and working together. And in fact, that is happening. For example, the Koreans have pushed back against Chinese EEZ encroachment in the Yellow Sea. They also have to, of course, monitor very volatile situation with regard to the northern limit line, not just on land, but there's a belief that it has some meaning out into the oceans. You remember in 2010, they experienced the sinking of one of their corvettes, frigate-sized vessel, and the loss of some 50 Korean sailors. So I think that they are certainly engaged in the area in some ways, perhaps more so than other countries. There are changes. For example, Japan providing capacity building to the Philippines, the United States also doing more. But I think all of these countries have to work in a concerted way to build security in the region and to strengthen the rule of law. So we need all of these, we need everybody to participate. And of course, China wants to deal bilaterally with states. But I think that I think that Korea has done quite a good job in managing the situation, given their proximity to China and the border that they have with North Korea.
Thank you, James. Eureka, a question for you. Do you think that some of these authorities that are contained in the amendments to these Coast Guard laws in the region could inadvertently lead to war?
Thank you for that question. It is actually a bit complicated one because it depends on the definition of an international armed conflict. And if you look at the definition of the term by ICRC, it says that an international armed conflict occurs when one or more states have recourse to armed force against another state, regardless of division or the intensity of this confrontation. Now, so it depends whether one could consider that the confrontation between the civil agencies could meet this definition, and one could argue that it does not. But the other view could be even though they are civil agencies, they could regard it as an armed force when it comes to when the state intends to use the organization in such a manner. So,
okay, thank you. James, I see that you're typing an answer to Phil Mead's question, so I won't read it. But there is another question. You can continue to answer that one. But this one has to do with the fact that the United States has not ratified UNCLOS emboldens China to display brazen behaviors regarding its excessive maritime claims in the West Philippine Sea. When and if will U.S. ratify UNCLOS unconditional?
Would you like for me to take that?
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a bit of a red herring. Does anybody think that China or anything is going to suddenly improve tomorrow if the United States ratifies the Law of the Sea Convention? My personal view is it would be on balance beneficial for the U.S. to do so. The U.S. has given up legal certainty within outer continental shelf. It also has given up legal certainty to be able to participate in deep seabed mining. There are other benefits that would facilitate greater cooperation with states such as Indonesia, Malaysia, perhaps India. And so I understand that there's a diplomatic cost that the United States is experiencing. And I think the US ought to join, and that would on balance be better for the US and as well for the region. On the other hand, I'm not sure that that gets any sort of concrete gain. China is not going to change any of its behavior at all. The United States is not going to change any of its behavior. The US has, since 1983, considered all of the provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention as reflective of customary international law and binding on all states. And the United States is one of the most observant countries for those provisions in the treaty. And I think it's regarded as such. No country really suggests that the United States is acting inconsistently with the convention. So, of course, it's easy to score a diplomatic point, or it's easy to score sort of points in a diplomatic setting by that the U.S. is not to the Law of the Sea Convention. And I think there could be some intangible benefits, but there's not going to be any sort of concrete movement if the United States joins. And I think probably eventually the U.S. will join. It's just that it's a function of our domestic process for joining a convention and the power of a minority of senators to be able to stop the movement of U.S. ratification.
Eureka, question for you. Doesn't the tension with UNCLOS that you describe arise from real security concerns from Southeast Asian nations? And how can the United States support protection from regional security threats that do not rise to the level of armed conflict and thereby incentivize adherence to basic UNCLOS principles?
Thank you. I agree that states updates their Coast Guard laws, and we organize the agencies out of the concern out of the security concern. So I agree that politically speaking, that there is the potential tensions among the Asian countries. And of course, one of the backgrounds might be China's claims over South China Sea. Now, of course, the United States could play an important role by basically, by showing that the freedom of navigation and other use of law, other use of sea is the core principle of the law of the sea in the region. And I think that the United States actually does demonstrate such principles, and by for instance conducting the freedom of navigation operations.
Thank you, Eureka. I'm going to ask two questions. They're separate questions, but they're kind of related, so I'll ask them for either of you to answer. After China categorically rejected it and the Philippines set it aside, what is the normative force of the 2016 PCA award among the ASEAN states and China today? Is it in danger of simply being ignored, for example, in the Code of Conduct negotiations? And then a related question to that is, why is the UN passive in these matters? Why has the UN remained inactive subsequent to the 2016 arbitration decision in favor of the Philippines and against China? What's the point of having international conventions and laws and official international courts if they are not applied by the relevant authorities?
Eureka, I'm glad to defer to you, or I can offer some thoughts.
Okay, so let me briefly answer these two questions. I think the significance of the 2016 award is first that it clarified the significance of a number of provisions of UNCLOS. It of course was one of the dispute solution process, but at the same time, it was an important occasion for legal scholars to clarify some of the disputed provisions. While the effects of the awards is debated amongst scholars and other experts, but I believe that the award has an impact, an important impact on the study of Love the Sea. Now, regarding the role of the United Nations, first, let me confirm that the United Nations itself is not the how to say that, the international organization that has demanded under UNCLOS. Of course, the convention was adopted in the United Nations Conference, and the UN has the strong impact in its implementation. But the United Nations is an independent body from the convention, right? And therefore, it is understandable that the UN is sort of the UN takes sort of a passive attitude regarding the arbitral award, but and so that's one thing. Of course, we cannot expect Security Council to say anything about it, and therefore I think that it is sort of understandable that the UN takes the passive attitude.
If I could just add to that, I began my presentation with a mention of legal realism, and I think that's what we're facing here in both of these questions. The normative force of the arbitration award still exists, and in fact, it may actually have some tangible change in China's approach as they've now shifted to the idea of the four shas rather than the 9-dash line. But the questions viewed as a whole really bring up what Eureka mentioned, if I could just emphasize, and that is that there is no such thing as the international community. There are nation states in international law. States make laws, and there is no international legislature. There's a UN General Assembly that has no authority over anything except its own budget under the necessary expenses case. There is no international court because you have, yes, the ICJ, but states are free to withhold their consent. And even ITLOS, you can see that China and Russia have failed to appear or have failed to comply with the decisions handed out. So there's no legislature, there's no judiciary, and most important of all, there is no executive. That's how the law is enforced in all of our countries. And as Eureka mentioned, the UN Security Council is simply unable to gain agreement on virtually anything with Russia and China wielding a veto. And so all of these three elements are missing in international law, which is why law is important as a normative force and as a guide in our countries that are invested in advancing the rule of law. But that doesn't mean that we can ignore the most important or most critical element of all, and that is geostrategic reality and economic and military strength.
All right, thank you, James. Eureka, I think we're out of time. Eureka, I see you have your hand up. You have a quick comeback or
Right. No, I basically agree with what Professor Kraska said, but I just wanted to take a more mild approach as an international lawyer. That UNCLOS has a strong, one of the strong, the strongest dispute settlement mechanism, and the 2016 award showed its possibility to make use of such mechanism.
Thank you. Well, we're out of time. Thank you both, Professor Ishii and Dr. Kraska, for your excellent presentations, and thank you to the audience for all of your excellent questions. I'll turn it back over to you, Yuki.
Thank you, Pete. And thank you again, Professor Kraska and Dr. Ishii for your wonderful presentation and your thoughts. We'll now transition into the panel 2, part 2 of this discussion. And we have, for the last 40 minutes or so, we have talked about the legal side of the evolution in the maritime security situation and in Western Pacific. So now we are actually going on to the more of a strategic environment in the Western Pacific side. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome back Professor Susumu Takai, who's a president of Security Strategy Research Institute of Japan, and Professor Kate Walsh, who's associate professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College, and who also was an old colleague of mine when she was back at Stimson as a senior associate many moons ago. So welcome to you both. I would first open this session by asking Professor Takai an opening question, and then I'll go to Professor Walsh, and then I will just go ahead and open up to questions and answers. So like the previous session, please do continue to write in your questions in a Q&A column. So with that, Professor Takai, if you can walk us through the evolving security environment in the Western Pacific for the last couple of years and any noticeable updates that you would like to have from last year's seminar when we convened. If you can give us that to start us off, that will be great.
ありがとうございます、辰巳先生。今日はこのセミナーにお招きくださいましてありがとうございました。私は高井進と申します。それでは今日冒頭にお話ししたいことをちょっとお話したいと思います。中国は2012年頃から海洋強国を目指し、わずか10年間で強力な海軍力を増強しました。で、海洋強国となった中国の長期的な目的は、アメリカを東アジアから太平洋へと駆逐し、アメリカと太平洋を第二列島線で二分割するということです。すなわちアメリカは東太平洋、中国は西太平洋をコントロールするために、アメリカと日本に A2AD 戦略を強要しています。しかし中国は現在の軍事力では、アメリカと戦争しても勝てないということを考えていますので、鄧小平が言った、外交手段ですね、の韜光養晦、すなわち才能を隠して内に力を蓄えるという状態にあります。で、中国はアメリカとの戦争に負けて、中国共産党が国民からの支持を失うことに恐れていると考えているからです。したがって中国はアメリカとの戦争に勝つことを確信するまで非軍事的な外交手段で長期目的を達成しなきゃならないと思っております。中国の中期的な戦略目的は太平洋への自由な通行を確保することで、そのためにはさまざまな手段でアメリカの日本や太平洋との安全保障関係の切り離しを画策することだと思います。太平洋への自由に通行するためには、尖閣諸島と台湾が大きな障害となるので、尖閣諸島や台湾をコントロールする必要があります。中国の当面の課題は、日本に心理戦を仕掛けて、尖閣諸島のコントロールと宮古海峡の自由通行を確保することです。中国は2013年に法執行機関として中国海警局を設立し、2020年に中央軍事委員会の指揮の下に置きました。現在、中国は中国海軍と法執行機関を合体させたハイブリッド戦略に基づいて海軍力を背景にした中国海警船の船舶が尖閣諸島や台湾の周辺海域で強引に中国の海洋権益を擁護するために戦狼外交を繰り広げています。中国は2021年1月に中国の海警法を立法し、 2月にこれを施行しました。同法は、中国の管轄水域で国内法違反の行為を行った外国の軍艦や政府公船に対して、管轄水域外へ退去を要請するために必要な警告とコントロール手段を規定しています。この手段には武器の使用が含まれています。また、中国海警船は国防法やその規則に従って中国軍事委員会の指揮下で国防の任務に従事することになっております。尖閣諸島周辺海域で中国の海警船と対峙するのは日本の法執行機関の巡視船です。日本の海上保安庁法によりますと、巡視船は日本の領海内で法秩序に違反して通航する外国船舶に対して合理的に必要であると判断される場合、武器を使用することができます。しかし、違反船が外国軍艦や政府公船である場合は、武器の使用ができないと規定しています。中国海警法が成立したため、巡視船や漁船の乗組員やその身体、生命に危険が及ぶ場合、巡視船は被害射撃ができることにしようと日本で議論されています。しかし、巡視船が先に発砲すれば、中国から自衛権を口実に武力で反撃してくる可能性があります。その上、巡視船の船体は中国海警船の砲撃に耐えられないと聞いていますので、被害射撃は実際的ではありません。また、中国は武器を使用すれば、アメリカが日米安保条約第5条に基づいて日本を支援することを知っているので、大型の海警船は武器の代わりにウォーターガンによる大量放水、あるいは船舶衝突などの方法で日本の巡視船の行動を妨害することが予想されます。大量放水や船舶衝突は自衛権行使の要件である武力行使になるのかどうか明確ではありません。また日本は中国との武力衝突を望まない人もたくさんいることも事実です。日中間には偶発的な軍事衝突を防止する海空連絡メカニズム、Japan China Maritime and Air Communication Mechanism というのがありますが、これは日中間の軍隊間に適用されるだけで、法執行機関同士の衝突には役に立ちません。で、中国の戦狼外交により、日本の巡視船が尖閣諸島周辺海域から排除されれば、諸国は尖閣諸島を中国の領土だと理解することになるでしょう。日本にとっては耐えられない事実です。台湾の馬祖諸島や澎湖諸島の沿岸では、中国のサルベージと母船がですね、大量に海砂を採取しています。海洋環境を破壊しています。これらの浚渫船の数は、2018年には71隻、2019年には600隻でしたが、2020年には3969隻に増加したと報告されています。現在、浚渫船と母船の付近には中国海警船がいるので、台湾の巡視船は手をこまねいているようです。また、中国はマスメディアで大量の偽情報を流し、台湾に心理戦を仕掛けています。国際社会、あるいは諸国は東シナ海の安全保障環境に関心を示して、中国の戦狼外交に対処するため、日本の自衛隊と共同訓練や演習を行い、でアメリカは台湾関係法に従って兵器等を台湾に供給していますが、私は東シナ海における抑止がいつまで続けられるのか心配しています。中国に対する抑止は法執行機関の衝突がきっかけとなって小規模な戦争へとエスカレーションすることが懸念されます。また、諸国が大規模な戦争へのエスカレーションを回避するために尖閣諸島や中国大陸沿岸の台湾の島嶼を中国領と認めることになれば、西太平洋の戦略環境は一変し、 アジア諸国の信頼を失ったアメリカは、中国によって第二絶倒戦外に駆逐される事態になるだろうということを考えています。どうもご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you, Takai Sensei, for your provoking thoughts, especially for the American audience about the U.S. being pushed out, the risk of being U.S. Being pushed out of the second island chain. So with that, Kate, I would very much welcome your reaction.
Well, thank you. Good morning. Thank you to Yuki, my former colleague, and to Pam Kennedy for this kind invitation, and to the very numerous fora that we've had together to talk about some of these difficult issues. I too must note that these are my own views and do not represent any official view of the U.S. government, Department of Defense, Navy, or Naval War College. And thank you, of course, to Take-san for an excellent, very detailed presentation. Before addressing it in detail, I'd like to start out focusing on two what I think are more macro trends that I think are important to this conversation and to the specifics that we'll get into. Both are related to current events. The first, of course, what's happening on the Ukraine-Russia border. As we've seen, Russia is once again threatening to invade and possibly annex the territory of another sovereign independent state, Ukraine, contrary to international law. Yet Russia is also appealing to international law in defense of and to legally justify its actions, and thereby exploiting and abusing international legal principles, but claiming legal premise. China does the same in pursuit of its maritime claims in the East and South China Seas. This behavior reflects an ideological schism between the West, which is following a rule of law construct in international affairs generally, and the Eastern communist or post-communist states who advocate more of a rules-based order based on rules dictated by political power, ruled by law. The challenge faced by the West here is akin to corporations that use unscrupulous lawyering to find loopholes or vacuums in the law to exploit. And so too are actors on the international stage seeking to identify and exploit international legal loopholes or vacuums where they can pursue their interests in expanding power and territory. I think the answer in both instances is to plug these loopholes and legal vacuums with laws that address such bad actors and actions. In the meantime, they are likely to be met on the international stage with military or paramilitary force, which is very likely to lead to broader conflict and war, as Take-san has noted. In short, to address the maritime gray zone, the most important tool to solve this conundrum is international law, not military solutions. The second macro trend is also current events related, the 21st century Sino-Russian strategic relationship. It's been clear for several years that Russia and China have established a strategic marriage of convenience. Beijing, at least, has made clear that Russia and China are aligned geostrategically and prepared to act as a global counterweight to the United States. But events overnight and in the next few weeks are likely to clarify just how close or not these two powers are and just how much Putin is willing to follow Xi's lead and vice versa, as well as how much each side is willing to tolerate and support the other's irredentist claims, especially if they prove costly. Maritime security in the Indo-Pacific will be affected fundamentally by this relationship. If there's a strong Sino-Russian strategic alliance beyond the current comprehensive strategic partnership, this adds substantial risk to the United States, Japan, and our other allied partnered efforts to preserve the peaceful, prosperous, and open Indo-Pacific. However, if a more challenging, complicated relationship emerges, this provides opportunity and reduces the degree of risk in facing a two-power front, diplomatically or militarily. So with these two broader themes in mind, let me turn to more specifically the presentation by Dr. Takai. The briefing explains well in detail, I think, the present conundrum faced by Japan and others in the Indo-Pacific, what to do about a great power using its expansive maritime and other resources to exploit others' territory or territorial claims, putting on the defense of any state wishing to try and stop such exploitation and against what is for some a much larger economic and military power. China's actions contravene international norms, practice, and law, though they also claim international legal justification for their actions, putting the resolution of this issue into the sphere of what is a slow-moving international jurisprudence and whose rulings states might ignore anyway, as China has done with the international arbitration in the name of state sovereignty. So who or what can stop states like China or enforce the rule of international law and other than by military means? I think the answer is multifold. First, no state can do it alone. Any successful effort to stop China or Russia from exercising its military, paramilitary, or other powers in ways that abuse the sovereignty and rights of other states will require a joint multilateral effort if it is to be successful in affecting Chinese or other decisions. To paraphrase a US founding father, we must go together or we will surely go down separately. Second, China has a documented record of exploiting and abusing international law, or at least the spirit of the law, in pursuing irredentist claims, which should be prosecuted. If no proper or practical venue exists to do so, as James has indicated, then a new one should be established to thwart the abuse of international law and to fill any loopholes or vacuums that China, Russia, or others are exploiting in the maritime sphere and elsewhere. The answer is to fill those international legal loopholes and those vacuums through diplomacy and international legal action. We tend to see the gray zone as a military problem, and it is, but it's also a failure of diplomacy, in my view. As University of Exeter legal scholar Aurel Sari has noted, there can be little hope of successfully countering the hostile instrumentalization of international law unless the international legal order is treated as a realm of action, he says, in what he terms operationalizing international law. Doing so will take a sustained multilateral effort, likely outside the UN Security Council, given China and Russia's P5 status. But as we witnessed international legal innovation be established after World War II to address the challenges to the international system that arose in that era, the same, I think, must happen now, in part to deter military conflict in and across the region. At the very least, such efforts will make clear how the international community will interpret and then react to together in the face of aggressive gray zone tactics. We need to go beyond UNCLOS and pursue additional legal means. One such novel idea that we discussed in our fora is the potential for broader maritime-based peacekeeping operations, whether through the UN or other newly established venues, in a way that goes beyond the collective anti-piracy operations that we did in the Gulf of Aden and elsewhere. This idea, this discussion also goes beyond Taki-san's presentation and the ideas on how the Japanese Coast Guard Maritime Self-Defense Forces can adapt through reforms to legal powers and authorities as ways to better address and be able to more effectively respond to China's lawfare, hybrid and gray zone tactics, which lie between the rules of war and the peacetime, all of which seek to exploit international legal loopholes, ambiguities, and legal vacuums. I agree that such efforts are necessary to allow Japan and other states to thwart such PRC tactics, which are likely to persist until countered effectively. Which leads me to my last observation, which is that a whole host of novel and innovative ideas are needed to find ways beyond military force, which is necessary but not sufficient, to disabuse China, Russia, and others of these sorts of gray zone hybrid lawfare-oriented tactics. This means devising new diplomatic, economic, informational, cyber, and in particular, international legal means and tools that could be brought to bear multilaterally in this contest. Again, noting Aurel Sari, who notes, had Clausewitz been a lawyer, he might have observed that law is but a continuation of politics by other means. And it's a strategic endeavor as well. Operationalizing international law, as he suggests, I think is a good idea. And will have the benefit of not only making irredentist or extraterritorial adventures more risky, but also more costly, and in terms that affect more than a state's international reputation. Some multilateral and international legal proactiveness will serve also to deter other actors and from similar actions in the future, while fortifying and unifying Western democracies around the idea of international rule of law over China and Russia's preferred system of international rule by law. As the presentation makes abundantly clear, though, time is of the essence. In the meantime, as he details, China's coercive maneuvers are succeeding, establishing fait accompli in the absence of an effective, coordinated, unified, and cost-imposing response, and that are also raising the cost of counteraction in the future, as he suggests, if it involves also the Senkakus and Taiwan, pursued by China in the same manner. So protecting freedom of navigation is not enough. Protecting the foundations of the international order is what is at stake. If we don't want a might makes right international regime of rule by law, we need to come up with new tools particularly international legal ones, to thwart powers pushing their might around at the expense of other sovereign states. In other words, we need to confront China and others in every non-military dimension as well. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kate, for excellent discussion, which actually goes beyond the scope of the Takai Sensei's presentation. So you really kind of put out the broad and then kind of honed in on his presentation. That was wonderful. Takai Sensei, did you have anything to add, or is it okay if we just go straight to the questions? I saw your hand raised earlier.
いや、失礼しました。間違えて手を挙げてしまいました。どうぞ質問を受けてください。
Okay. So let me go right into the questions. So this particular one, I'm going to start with this one. This may actually, I have to pull in the wisdom of our legal team that preceded us in our previous panel. But there's a question from the audience regarding the issues of sovereignty over Asian islands and archipelagos. Why is the case of the Russian occupation and militarization of the Kuril Island for over 75 years still not addressed? What kind of precedent is this passivity on the Kurils making vis-a-vis the more recent cases, such as in the East or South China Sea? Takai Sensei, Kate, you do have the first chance to respond, but then if Ishii Sensei or James or Pete, if you can help us on the legal aspect of it, I would I would encourage you to do so. So maybe I would go from Takai Sensei or Kate.
わかりました。はい。
And then I'll go to James. How's that?
はい、ありがとうございます。国内法、国内政治の問題がありますけれども、まず北方領土と竹島、これは日本の領土ですけれども、現実にはロシアがコントロールしてますし、韓国がコントロールしているということで、日本はこれは領土問題として取り扱っております。しかしながら、国際問題は平和的に解決しなければならないというふうに憲法で書かれていますので、まずは外交交渉から始めようということで、ロシアとずっと、首脳会談をやっております。しかし、プーチンが憲法を改正しまして、そしてもう領土の返還はありえないというようなことを決めましたので、なかなか難しいんですが、でもその努力は続けています。韓国の方はもう憲もほろろですね、全くそういう議論にもならないという態度をご存知の通りです。翻って尖閣の場合は、日本の領土であって、日本が今領有権を行使している、統治権を行使しているというところ、それに対して中国がいろんな、チャレンジをしてくるということなので、日本としてはですね、これをなんとか日本の主権のもとに維持しなければならない。しかし、先ほど申し上げましたように、戦狼外交ですね、背後に中国の海軍の背景としてですね、場合によっては武器を使うぞというような政策、それから船をすごく大型化して1万2000トンほどの船がもう何隻かできているわけですね。日本の巡視船は一番大きくても6500トンなんです。で、これがまともにぶつかったら日本の巡視船は沈められてしまうかもしれない。そうするとあまり近くまで寄れないとかですね。それから南シナ海でベトナムの巡視船が中国の海警船に沈められた、大量放水で沈められて事件もある。ああいうことになっても困るということもあって、日本で本当に対処に困っているんです。で、今日は皆さんのご意見を伺いながらですね、日本がどうしたらいいのかということをいろいろと知りたいと思っております。どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you, Takai Sensei. I know Ishii Sensei also typed in a question in response to that, but James, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. In particular, with regard to the set of questions from Philip Mead, thank you, Philip, very much for the positive engagement. I guess what I would say is that what we want from law is a stability of expectations, and we no longer have that. So it's a breakdown, obviously, of the rule of law or the parameters by which states will operate. So this is not very difficult at all. we're not going to get out of this through legal ninja tricks. You're not gonna get your way out of this simply through law. Law is part of it. Law is one element, but that's not going to be the solution. And we can see that we've failed so far by continually talking about the law and neglecting the other elements. And so what are those? Well, we know that when there is an armed attack under the UN Charter, that states are entitled to self-defense. Yes, but all of the things that we've experienced so far probably don't rise to that threshold, that level of an armed attack. So then what? What does the law say in that case? And what it says is that when states suffer internationally wrongful acts, such as, for example, the Chinese patrolling in another country's territorial sea or exclusive economic zone, patrolling for fisheries in the EEZ, or even asserting law enforcement jurisdiction in the Senkaku Islands territorial sea. When those internationally wrongful acts occur, then states are lawfully able to impose countermeasures. They may suspend normal international obligations or duties in order to induce compliance on the part of the other country. And so the question is not, do the legal tools exist? The legal tools are there. Again, you're not going to get out of this through new legal ninja tricks, new treaties, new agreements. What is required is the willpower to be able to use the existing legal tool set.
Thank you, James. And Ishii Sensei for your support. So next question is for both Kate and Takai Sensei. If China's aim to break through the first island chain to dominate the Western Pacific, does it not become more important for the US and Japan to support and build alliances with the small South Pacific island nations? I'll start with you, Kate.
Yes, an excellent question, and I'd agree. Basically what my statement suggested is that we're looking at the gray zone and these challenges mainly through the military or paramilitary lens, which is, as I said, necessary but not sufficient. And though I agree wholeheartedly with James, I think that operationalizing the legal tools is something that, yes, the lack of will, but also a lack of imagination, that we're not constrained necessarily to the existing legal capabilities or venues, that we can create more. And I think with the creation of the Quad, we're starting to see some of these new innovations, but they're still very much militarily focused. And I think that's just not sufficient. In order to provide the will to act and react in a lawful way, I think we can provide more tools and more capabilities, be more innovative and imaginative, and reach out using information, diplomacy, economic statecraft in ways that we just haven't been doing. We tend right towards the military response because that's there, it's available, and we exercise it regularly. We don't exercise as regularly these other tools in our toolkit, and it's become obvious, but we really do need to be front and center and pressing what is possible in this domain to make, as James says, more clear, to be more transparent about how we interpret these actions in the gray zone below the rule of war, and what we would do about it collectively and individually. And that is sort of the missing piece, I think, that would perhaps at least deter somewhat actors like China and others who are looking to exploit these gaps.
Kai Sensei, do you have any additional thoughts before I go to the next questions?
いえ、なんかたくさん質問があるようですから、先にお願いします。
Okay.
はい、はい。
Then next one is for you, Takai Sensei. As you pointed out, Japan Coast Guard is confronting Chinese Coast Guard of the Senkaku Islands for quite some time. What will be the most effective option for Japan to counter and deter Chinese ambition? Is there any good idea other than just continue to strengthen capability of the Japan Coast Guard?
よろしいですか。はい、ありがとうございます。まさに今そこをですね、協議しているところなんですけれども、もともと巡視船は漁船、その他の不審船対処のために、作られているわけですね。また行動しているわけです。したがって、あまり大きな声で言えませんが、例えば船体の鉄板だとか、ああいうものはそれほど厚くないわけですね。したがって、中国の海警船は76ミリメートルの、砲を持っているということを聞いておりますので、そういう砲で、撃たれたらですね、ひとたまりもないというようなことがあります。そのようなことからですね、まだまだ巡視船に対して、その中国のアンビションに対抗するようなですね、グレーゾーンにおいて対抗するような能力を付与していないわけですから、そこがとても私も心配しているところなんです。答えになりませんけどもですね、本当にどうしていいかわからないところです。ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Kate, I think let me start this next question with you. If one looks at the response from US and its allies in the case of Indo-Pacific and Taiwan situation vis-a-vis Ukraine, these are quite different, though the evolving maritime issues in the Indo-Pacific is very significant too. So do you have any additional comments on this one, since you're the one who started from Ukraine?
I did. I think they're connected, as I suggested, in terms of the Sino-Russian, whatever it is. It's a comprehensive strategic partnership, but is it really evolving into more of an alliance? I think is the question at hand. I'm a little dubious that it will actually become that because of historic Sino-Russian challenges. But it's something, of course, to keep an eye out for, because that really does change the nature of the competition. At the same time, I think it's a bit hazardous analytically to make the analogy between Ukraine and Taiwan, because I think the differences are substantial and important in how, in at least the United States, views the Ukraine as how we view Taiwan. So I think if Beijing were to take lessons from Ukraine vis-a-vis Taiwan, that could be dangerous. And I think we want to be very clear in both cases, but in particular Taiwan, what we would do and wouldn't do. And yet at the same time, I suppose paradoxically, I'm not a fan of moving off of the more ambiguous policy that we have, honestly. So it's a conundrum, but I think there are hazards there, is I guess what I would say, both in the way that we interpret the two as being connected and how the two might be connected in Beijing. I think we want to be very clear in our diplomacy and our actions that one doesn't necessarily affect the other.
Thank you. Takai-sensei, do you have a thought? And on that, I think to both of you, there is a very short question. Do you support President Putin's suggestion to solve maritime disputes under the UN?
I'll go. I don't support President Putin in any way. At the same time, the UN is one forum for peacekeeping. I was proposing that is not necessarily the only one. In fact, peacekeeping can be done through other mechanisms, and I would advocate exploring that potential, because I think having a neutral peacekeeping force, a maritime peacekeeping force, is one of those potentially innovative ideas. We've written a draft paper on it that is timely and could be useful in this context.
Takai-sensei, do you have a thought?
はい。国連で審議するのはとてもいいことなんですが、決定的にもう国連役に立たないのはですね、プーチンもそうですけども、ロシアもそうですけど、中国も常任理事国なんですね、平和安全保障理事会の。もう中国が気に入らない、いわゆる中国の野心に反するようなことは、中国は必ずと言っていいほど拒否権を行使すると私は思っています。プーチンも口ではそういうことを言いますけども、実はこういう問題については、あまり国連は役に立たない。もっと大きな、例えば、クリミア半島がどうのこうのとかね、ウクライナの東部ウクライナがどうのこうの、そういう問題であれば、 もうすぐにでも戦闘が開始されるような事態ですから、国連が動くかもしれません。しかし、この東アジアの当初の問題はあまりにも小さすぎて、それは2国間で解決せよということしか言わないと思うんですね。それからもう一点、さっきの質問の答えでちょっと言い足りなかったのはですね、中国と台湾との関係。これは中国は台湾は中国の一部だと言ってるからですね、台湾の領土領海も全部中国のものだと、こう言ってやってるわけですね。台湾の方から見れば、いや、とんでもないってことなんですね。で、日本と中国の場合は、やはりその違う台湾と中国との関係と違いますけども、もう軍事的にですね、圧倒的に中国が強いということですよね。したがって日本は、日本国内で、問題が起こったら、侵略されたら戦う力しか持ってなくて、外の国に対してはアメリカの、日米安保条約に期待するという政策なので、実はその隙をうまくついているのが中国の今のウォルフ・ウォリア・ディプロマシー、戦狼外交だと私は思っております。以上です。ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Next question is for Takai Sensei, but I would also welcome Kate's additional thoughts. So Takai Sensei, China has continued to develop an A2AD capabilities, as you laid out in your presentation, with the new Dongfang 21 presenting a severe challenge to the United States in intervening in a conflict within the theater. Do these innovations we see in China erode United States' ability to deter Chinese aggression? Or in your view, do these new developments might impact the confidence that Japan has in the U.S. ability to help Japan support its effort to defend the country?
いえ、お答えします。質問ありがとうございました。質問の意味がちょっとよく分かりにくかったんですけども、やはり日本はその単独では、もちろん日本の領土は単独で守る決心ではいますけども、核を持っていない、長距離ミサイルも持っていないというようなですね、圧倒的な力の差が中国との間にあります。したがってアメリカがですね、その日本の欠点、あるいは足りないところを補ってくれるという政策を取ってきているわけです。したがって東アジアのこの東シナ海のこういう問題についてもですね、アメリカの果たす役割がとっても大きいと思っております。したがってこれなくしてはですね、心理戦争って先ほど申し上げましたけどもですね、もう日本は中国に負けるんだということを心理戦に持ち込まれていますので、もう尖閣も諦めなきゃいけないなとか、そういう気持ちにさせられるのは情けないんです。また残念ながらそういう日本人もいるんですね。これは何とかしたいなと私は考えております。以上です。ありがとうございます。
Thank you. Kate, what do you think? Especially on this Chinese modernization, especially on the military forces, including the deploying of those long-range missiles that could hit the United States. Do you think that could impede U.S. ability or U.S. Resolve to intervene to support Japan defend its territory?
Well, obviously, it complicates matters. But does it fundamentally alter the relationship? No, I don't think so. And it's not a new development either. We've been dealing with this for some years now, and other Chinese military modernizations. The speed of Chinese military modernization it has been somewhat surprising to some, and yet not wholesale surprise. So I think we've been dealing with this. Our strategies obviously will be affected, but not fundamentally. I think it just makes things potentially more difficult, but it raises again the reason why we need to address these challenges in more than simply military terms. Yes, that's necessary, but all of these other capabilities in order to signal, to make clear to China and to our allies and to our partners what we intend to do. There's sufficient evidence now of China's behavior and therefore its intentions in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. And so now we need to make clear what we will do, this administration and others, and where the lines are, not red lines in the sense, but our own sort of code of conduct. If these activities continue, this is what we expect that we will do, or at least how we will interpret them, and make that clear, and increase some of the cost, the normative force, as James put it, to these actions. So it may not be an action-reaction dynamic, but it wouldn't be cost-free either.
So before I go to Takai Sensei's hand raise, we're quickly approaching the last 3 minutes of the seminar.
そうですか。
So if you can hold your thoughts just for a moment, Takai Sensei.
はい、
Last
わかりました。
question is for both of you. So perhaps Takai Sensei can include his hand raise aspect of his remarks and when he answers this one. So last question, this is to both of you, like I said. Part of the Chinese gray zone operation is buying or bribing or co-opting political leaders in Southeast Asia. China is grooming a populist presidential candidate, for example, in the Philippines, who has already declared that he's open to bilateral negotiation with Beijing. He considered the 2016 arbitral award useless, and he sees Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty as a trigger for war. According to him, there is simply to point in challenging China because it is powerful. How should Washington and Tokyo view these political developments in a key U.S. ally in Southeast Asia? So maybe I will go to Kate first, and then ask Takai Sensei to finish.
Oh, okay, I'll be very quick then. Obviously, worrisome developments, not really a surprise. China's modus operandi at this point. And yet, what are the weapons of the West and democracies, right? Transparency. Make there be a cost to this kind of activity. Make it clear, make it public, as you know, this type of forum does. What is China doing in these spaces? One of the, I think, most powerful tools in this sphere has been the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, making visible, literally, to everyone who wants to see what is happening out there at sea, making clear China's actions, let that speak for itself. And I think this kind of approach, while not necessarily going to resolve the issue, is going to make clear what our values are, what our standards are, and what our code of conduct is and will be.
Thank you. Takai Sensei, last words from you.
はい、ありがとうございます。短くお返事します。この事態は中国の共産党が正しいと信じている路線なんですね。これをなかなか変えることは難しいと思います。しかし、私はパワーポイントスライドの中でちょっと書いてありますけども、例えばオーカスとかクアッドなんかの、国際的な関心が非常に深まってきて、軍艦なんか派遣してくれているということは日本にとってとても嬉しい励ましになりますし、共同訓練も陸上においてもやっております。こういうようなことで世界の関心がここに集まれば、中国もそうおいそれとその野心を戦狼外交で追求することはないだろうと、少しスピードが遅くなるだろう。しかし最終的にはこの抑止力がどこまで続くか、これは先ほど申し上げましたように一番心配しているところです。どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Takai Sensei. Thank you, Kate, again for your contributions. And from previous panel, thank you, Ishii Sensei, James, and Pete for extremely interesting presentations and discussions. Professor, just to note to everyone, the PowerPoint that Dr. Ishii used for her remarks, and also there's another set of PowerPoint that Professor Takai was meaning to use, but he decided against it for the interest of time at the last minute. Both of those PowerPoint slides will be available on our event website shortly after this seminar concludes. So if you feel like you missed something from Dr. Ishii's presentation, or same thing for Dr. Takai, please do visit our event page again in a few days. Thank you so much for so many of you participating in the early Friday morning seminar for many of us in the United States, and such a late night from those of you who are chiming in, joining us from Japan. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again. And this concludes our seminar.